So I'd like to start off today and introduce Colonel Jerry Wheaton, doctor, who commanded the Cameron Bay Hospital, and his wife, Patricia. Doctor, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ben. First time I saw Vietnam was after I'd read Hell in a Very Small Place, which was the story of Dien Bien Phu. If you haven't read it, read it. A number of people high in the administration should have read that before we even gotten this affair. I knew what I was getting into. And the first time I came into Vietnam was through the back door, across Cambodia, into Vietnam, just about Van Matuit. Dropped down to Saigon and got into the Majestic Hotel for the first bath and shower I'd had in about 3 months, and went on up to the bar on the roof to have a drink, and the radio was on. They were talking about this missile crisis in Cuba. I didn't, of course, have a clue about what was going on because I hadn't heard anything for about 4 months. Next time I was in Vietnam was when we were supporting the U-2s flying out of Bien Hoa. This was in '65 and '66. And at that time I was the commander of the Air Force Hospital at Davis-Monthan outside of Tucson, Arizona. At that time, I volunteered to take over the hospital that was to be built at Cam Bay, and in July of '67, relieved Colonel McIlvaine, who was the first commander of that hospital, and found a tent city, Quonset huts, a surgery built out of packing cases that somebody had been smart enough to put swamp coolers and a couple of window air conditioners in so they could keep the temperature fairly regulated. It worked. The plans for the hospital at Cam were a new design. You poured concrete pads, put up steel brackets, and then fitted polycarbonate panels in them that were sandwiches. They were light, they were good insulation, and they worked. Hospital went up very quickly, and all of a sudden, construction stopped cold. I went over and started talking with the engineers, and I said, "What's the problem?" "Well, the plans call for non-ferrous pipe, and all we have are straight lengths of non-ferrous. We don't have any joints." I said, "Look, you've got ferrous joints, don't you?" "Oh yeah, we got plenty of that." I said, "Well, use the ferrous joints, encase it in concrete." I said, "By the time that rots out, we'll be long gone." And we were. Anyway, we got the sewage system set up and the water into the hospital, and the thing built up until, the last 2 sets of wards, the last 2 ward buildings. These were built in an H shape. The long letters, the long bars of the H were the wards, and then across the center bar were rooms that could be used. They were originally thought of as offices. We used them as minor surgical rooms. 2 of those buildings were unfinished at the start of the Tet Offensive. Of course, nobody knew what was really going to happen. And incidentally, when I was recalled to active duty during Korea, I was with the 47th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. When I got to Vietnam, every single man from the 47th who was still on active duty was there, plus 2 more who had retired and were working for the contractor Morrison Knudsen in Van Matuit. things looked pretty good. My kids had cashed in some war bonds and sent their mother over to Thailand, and I was taking R&R, and we're going to celebrate a wedding anniversary. A friend of mine, Colonel Wayne Curran, was the military attaché in Bangkok, and I went over there. We were wined and dined, and I attended a big reception for General Creighton Abrams and met him. The next day, the phone rang, my boss at Cameron, and he said, "We're sending an F-4 in with your gear in the rear seat. Be at Don Muang at such and such an hour." He said, "Change on the tarmac, get your gear on, and get back here." And that's exactly what I did. That was the start of the Tet Offensive. It started slow for us because the original casualties filled up the Army hospitals. Pretty soon, we were sending 130s up with ammo and supplies, and they were retrograding casualties, and our hospital began to fill up. Finally filled up to the point where even the 2 unfinished ward combinations had to be used. Without any electricity, we solved the light problem by getting a generator, some floodlights from the flight line, opening the doors at one end, bouncing the lights off the ceiling to give illumination, and filled them with walking wounded. They could use the latrines and the adjacent wards that were operative. Very soon, I had almost 1,000. We had a capacity of 1,000 beds, and I almost had 1,000 patients. So I called the colonel that had a convalescent hospital north of us by about 15 kilometers and asked him if he could take some of my casualties, the walking wounded. "Oh, no," he said, "you're Air Force and your patients are mostly Marines and a few Army." He said, "I've got a quota for Marines." Well, about 6 months before, General Krulak, who is the Marine Commandant in the Pacific, had come through with his gunnery sergeant. And he said, "Hey, Doc, here's my quarters phone number." He said, "Just in case you ever need to get a hold of me, don't hesitate to call me." You know, I got my wallet out, got Krulak's phone number out, called him, and it's about 3 o'clock in the morning in Hawaii. And I told him the problem. He said, "Doc, if you don't get a call from that colonel at the convalescent hospital within 10 minutes, you call me back." 5 minutes later, my phone rang. It was the colonel. "How many do you want to send?" And that's the way it went. We had, Ben has already mentioned the dust-off choppers. This was probably the best demonstration of medical expertise with the helicopter arm of the Army that I have ever seen. We were able to bring casualties in very quickly, much better than during the Korean War, stabilize them, get them on other aircraft, retrograde them back to, as a matter of fact, while they were in the air, they were being triaged. That information then was sent to Saigon, to the command post, and there they looked to see where the nearest empty operating room was, and that's how people were moved from one side to another. The operating rooms were the deciding factor. If the casualty was severe, that's what decided where the casualty went. Before we got into this, we had some practice. My job as a medical commander was not just to, my job was management and construction and training. Before the Tet Offensive even occurred, we had a state body truck full of Vietnamese workers, about 75, and the driver took a curve too quickly. We had about 45 to 50 casualties from that. That was the best live training exercise we could have ever had because it happened just before the Tet Offensive. They brought them in, some of them by dust-off chopper, some of them by ambulance, some of them by jeep, and I had my administration office was on the second floor of a wooden building that had a balcony. I took a bullhorn, went out on the balcony, and I used the bullhorn, and we did the triage. They just laid the casualties out on the sand, did the triage. We had two, one with a ruptured spleen, another with a serious injury. They went to surgery immediately. We never lost anybody. Now I think it's time for me to turn it over to my wife, Pat Goodwyn. Pat was there long before I was, when it was a sand pile and tents. I'd like to introduce Patricia Goodwyn Wheaton.
My husband forgot to mention, I didn't know he did this till more recently after we married, but he also flew night missions with the pilots as the backseater. And so he was, he had got 100 hours, he said, flying backseat. Okay, I'll tell you something about what it was like to be a nurse there and what the living conditions were, because some of you might be interested in that, some of the ladies anyway. Well, let me go back a bit. I went into the Air Force after I had been working in in-service education at University of Missouri hospitals. And so I had been there a while, and I had furniture, and I wanted to move, and I didn't know how I could pay for the furniture moving. So I went into the Air Force for all the wrong reasons. Plus there was a good, recruiter who gave all the spiel, of how wonderful it's going to be. So anyhow, I enlisted and took the oath right before I was 35 years old, right before I would become too old to join. So I took it on the 24th of December, 1995. And the next day I was 35 years old. So my first duty station after basic training, I was sent to Vandenberg Air Force Base out here in California, which was lovely. It was quite an experience. And so during that time, arrived about 3 months after I arrived there, there was a call for nurses to at least volunteer for Vietnam. So I thought, why not? I'll go volunteer, but they won't take me. I'm too old to do this, and they'll know I'm too old. So I went and volunteered, and in December I got orders. I talk about shock. I really was sort of shocked. And then I finally decided, well, look at it this way. It's going to be an adventure, which it was. So anyway, in late January, the group of us, I think there were 12 of us nurses, two or three men, and the rest of us were ladies. That we met at Travis and flew over together. Well, actually, they had a whole plane full of people, but there were only about 8 or 9 female nurses. So we were the first nurses going into Air Force nurses. I won't say Army weren't already there, but Air Force nurses going into Vietnam. And so we went into Cam Ranh Bay and got there in February 1966. Well, it was literally the sand pile. There were just mainly dirt roads. The sand, you had to wear combat boots and fatigues for about the first 6 months because the sand came up to about mid-ankle, up above your ankle and below your knee, but it came up fairly high. And it was the beginning of the monsoons, and it was hot and wet, and it was really kind of, I got off the plane and I said, what am I doing here? What did you do to yourself? I thought, I want to go home. You know, there you are. So anyhow, I think the gentleman put up our tents the day before we arrived. Literally, they were large tents, and they held four nurses. In other words, you had your bunk bed. You had your, not bunk beds, but you had your bed. You had some place to hang your clothes in one of the what do you call those, Jerry? Or, you know what they call them? The lockers, middle lockers, and you had a trunk, and it was, and maybe you had a chair. It was pretty fundamental, and we were eating out of mess kits and walking, you know, to every place we went, and we were. They really didn't have the hospital started. They were working on the 10 hospitals, and they finished those within about 2 weeks after we arrived. So that was an experience to have the patients in the tent hospital, because the sand would blow through, and the poor corpsman and you yourself, you'd have to sweep to take this sand out, and sand got into everything. In fact, the chief nurse once came and she said, I want you to clean up this chart rack when we were getting ready to move into another facility. So I scrubbed and all that you do to get a chart rack clean. Well, she came in and she did her white finger thing, and she said, there's some sand here. I thought, what do you think? I mean, you clean it up, and there it was again. You know, so it was. You couldn't keep the sand out. You know, it got into everything, all your clothes, your hair, your nose, everything. So, in any case, we really did not have that many real sick people to start off with. We had quite a few psychiatry patients, the guys that would, and they were something else, because they would run away and go down to where they could buy liquor overnight, come back the next morning. They'd hide the bottles of liquor in the sand, and you couldn't quite corral these guys. And then we had quite a few medical patients, some people with jungle rot, some other problems, but nothing to like severe casualties to start off with. We did start getting in, while we were still in tents, some of the Marines who were wounded pretty badly. And I could never get over these guys. This one man I'll never forget, because he had a big open wound in his back here, in his chest. We kept we changed the packing on that, you know, like every day. He'd get up and walk down to the commissary, and, you know, he wasn't going to be beat, you know, the Marines. And you remember individual people like this that were so absolutely fantastic. After I was there about 3 or 4 months, I got involved with going out part-time with the Medical Civic Action Team. And this was a team that went out and took care of the local Vietnamese. That I really enjoyed, and actually by the time that I finished my tour of duty at Vietnam, I was going out someplace in the area, in the province, every day. That we would fly out on a helicopter, we'd take sand pans and go to another village, or take a 6x and then take a sand pan, and we had these big metal containers with all the medical equipment and dressings, etc. We'd have a dentist, a doctor, myself as a nurse, and the corpsman. And so that was really, I enjoyed that very much. And that was a good part of my experience there. The other part was taking care more of medical and surgical patients. And also, during about the last 3 months I was there, I went down to, that's how I met Colonel Wheaton. He was our second hospital commander that came in. And I had made the mistake of wanting to get a 3-month extension so I could go through Europe to my next duty station during the summer, when the snow wasn't on the ground. Well, I was given 6 months extension. So that's actually how I met my future husband, was in Vietnam. But in any case, I met him when our previous colonel called me in, and he said, now you're going to report, you're going to go down to Saigon on this. What I was going to do was to do a research study of the medical care in the Vietnamese military hospitals. And that was quite interesting because their hospitals were very primitive, like with 2 or 3 people of their military in a bed, of the latrines being terribly filthy, and a lot of flies, and not much netting to keep these people from getting malaria. It was just really bad. And but anyhow, I did that about 2 out of the last 3 months I was there. And so I left. I really left before the Tet Offensive. Things were getting very risky out in Medcap. In fact, I was going out some during the evening to go down to the village chief's compound to do some teaching to the young people. And the young people, the Vietnamese, thought this was wonderful. They'd get a big truck and they'd all pile on. It was like it was a social occasion. And they'd go down there in this truck, and we would teach them. We'd show films like on childbirth, how to manage a childbirth, and teach them environmental medicine and first aid. And on the way back one night, I got shot at, and I could hear the bullet go by. And that was not too funny. I got the brown star out of that, but it wasn't quite worth it. It was a little bit too close. So things were getting a little tight. So after I left, I think Colonel Wheaton had to close down the Medcap group going out. It was just getting a little bit too risky there. We did lose. It wasn't all fun and games. We did have sometimes that were really fun. I mean, people in wartime make the best of a bad situation. That we had some fun times, you know, out on the beach, etc. And we bonded. I mean, especially the nurses. We got so close to each other, and so we still are close, you know. And you're close over the lifetime. And but we lost some of the pilots. I remember, you know, we'd lose them, and that it would be, and the Air Force would, in other words, to deal with it, they would have a party at the bar and stack up glasses as high as they could stack them up before they would break them. And I don't know exactly why they did that, exactly what the significance was, but they had to deal with their grief some way. And it was a way of having a party and dealing with their grief. And maybe feeling like it can't happen to me. We had some of the dental people who went out on, I was on a manifest when I was going to Saigon. They were going up to Quinh Nhon, and their plane broke in half on the runway. And there were these incidents where you think, it could have been me, you know, it could have been me. I, just on behalf of all the male nurses, too, out in the field, the Army nurses, who really did the on-site, the best nursing that there was, I have to give credit and give honor to them. We the females, and we were, in a sense, protected as much as possible. You know, on the sheet that that you may have, I wrote down that I said that certainly that was an experience that taught me how much that the men of our military give and how much they do really to protect and take care of the women of this nation. You know, you could see them doing all sorts of these grungy tasks. I mean, the guys would be out emptying the latrines. They would be out, you know, building things, of dealing in the dust and you know, just the worst things that you could imagine. And we were considered to be an R&R area. You know, we weren't like out in the field getting shot at. But I was really impressed with how much men do for us. It was a wonderful experience, one that I wouldn't give $1 million for, but I wouldn't give a nickel to do it again.